Today's daf we're going to be learning is Yoma Mem Vav. We're going to start before we start, I just want to review something at the end of yesterday's daf. And I also want to remind everyone, I think I might have forgotten to mention, but Shuli Mishkan's article this week in Flashback is all about the Ktoret, the incense, what made up the incense. It's a very good read, especially we're going to spend a lot of time talking about incense. It's a good way to understand better what the incense is, what it was made of, all different details about it. So now we're going to go back to the very end of the daf. What we saw at the end of the daf, and it's a little bit confusing, and I'll tell you that also the commentaries, there's different opinions about it, which makes, right, sometimes things are a little confusing, and then you realize that, well, it wasn't just us who were confused, but again, whenever there's many opinions, it shows there's a little confusion here. They seem to be talking about the pasuk that they darshan, that we ended the Gemara yesterday with this discussion about the mizbeach, the maracha for the incense. And the verse they brought was the incense for Yom Kippur. Remember, there's one for the incense for Yom Kippur. Everybody agreed there was a unique one. And one for the incense in general, right? Where they would take coals. They would have a different coal pile of coals in one place and a pile of coals in another place. One for regular incense and for the candelabra. And the other one specially for Yom Kippur. So the pasuk that they used to explain this, milifnei Hashem, and it's before God, but it doesn't necessarily have to be exactly opposite the entrance to the Heichal. So, and there, I think I mentioned the Rambam, it's actually Tosfot who says that ideally it should be opposite the Heichal, it just doesn't have to be. So in any case, that seemed to be on these verses, it's from the verses that talk specifically about Yom Kippur. However, there are commentaries here who say that this is also meant to be explaining where the general Maracha for the Ktoret was, the Maracha Shniya, and that they were both in a similar location, and that the reference in this verse also is a reference to the Mizbach HaKtoret. Okay, and it's not the Mizbach HaKtoret, sorry, the Maracha Hashniya, which is meant for the coals to be taken from there for the incense on a daily basis. So it's a debate here whether this Gemara is referring specifically to that or not necessarily. Okay, and that's where I showed you on the map where that one is. I didn't have on our map where the one on Yom Kippur is because it didn't show us once a year, but it had it not opposite the Heichal exactly, right? It was on the western side facing, but not exactly opposite the entrance of the Heichal, to which I said it could be there's different opinions about it. And again, I want to check the pictures in the Marota Yomi that we've been sharing on the site. I think there, right there, it had it closer to, there it was opposite the entrance to the Heichal. It actually has them both opposite the entrance to the Heichal. If you look there, both the one on Yom Kippur and the one on every day for the incense. So anyway, there's a bit of a debate about what this is referring to. And now we're going to move on to Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir had said there were 5 marachot, and number 4, right, number 5 is obviously the one that's the for Yom Kippur, but number 4, what's number 4? It's for the parts, okay, the parts, the Evarim, Uptarim, and Chalavim, all the parts of the animal, they're supposed to be burnt. And usually they put them on the altar somewhat before nighttime, sometimes even at nighttime, and then they're left all night to burn. And if they weren't fully burned, or Rashi even, I saw right now that Rashi on Daf Mem Hey says in Dibor Matril Shalom Nitaklu, it's almost halfway down the page, he says, Shalom nitnu maracha, o nitnu v'lo ispiku litakel. They either weren't put on at all, for whatever reason, or they were put on and didn't finish burning, or didn't finish, getting totally burnt. Then in the morning, what happens? In the morning, they have to remember, they put out the new maracha, they put a whole row of logs, and then they put 2 logs on top. So they have to be taken off. And then what happens to them? So according to all the other opinions, they're put back on the altar. According to Rabbi Meir, there's a special altar just for them, because we need probably an issue of space, really. We need space, right? And the new maracha is for the new day, not for yesterday's stuff. So it has a new pile. So now, Amar Rabbi Elazar Mishum Bar Kapara. Rabbi Elazar now comes and says in the name of Bar Kapara, Omer Haya Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir was known to have said, pay attention, he's saying it in the name of Rabbi Meir, Evrei Ola Shenitotu, if there are parts, limbs of the Korban Ola that were left, Oseh Lahem Maracha B'fnei Atzma Usodran V'afilu V'sodran V'afilu B'Shabbat. So he says, if there's parts left over, then you make a new Maracha and you organize them there. Okay, so far, sounds exactly like our Mishnah. And then he adds the words va'afilu b'Shabbat, and even on Shabbat. Now, why is it even on Shabbat? Because on Shabbat, what's the story? Shabbat, we know that in the temple, you're allowed to do anything you need for sacrifice, right? You can slaughter the animal, right? There was a debate maybe about machshirei mitzvah, like can you bring the knife for shechita? But basically, you can slaughter animals, you can make fires, you can do all sorts of things that you generally can't do on Shabbat, because korbanot are doche Shabbat. We learned that, and we'll see it later today. It says you have to bring it b'mo'ado, in its right time. And if its right time is Shabbat, then obviously you have to desecrate Shabbat. Some people actually say, what do you mean? It says, Olat Shabbat Shabbato. You don't even need to darshan the words mo'ado. It's obvious because it lists korbanot you're supposed to bring on Shabbat. If you have to bring them on Shabbat, obviously you have to be mechalel Shabbat for them. In any case, he says, why is it even on Shabbat? Because what are we doing? We're burning something that was from yesterday's sacrifice, a Yom Chol from Friday. Maybe you wouldn't think that you could do that on Shabbat. So he comes to teach you, even that can be done on Shabbat. And that's the simple reading of Bar Kapara. To which the Gemara says, firstly, there's two parts, like I said. One is every day. Every day you burn them on a new maracha. So about that part, they say, my kamashmanan. What's it coming to teach us? We don't need this. Tanina, this is a very common structure. It says, why do we need to learn this? It already said so in the Mishnah. Somebody doesn't need to tell us that Rabbi Meir says the following if what Rabbi Meir said is actually in the Mishnah. So, my kamashmanan tanina b'chol yom yusham arba marachot, and that's Rabbi Meir. So you don't need to tell us, Bar Kapara, that that's what Rabbi Meir says. So, to which Amar Rabbi Avin lo nitzcha ela lipsulin. Rabbi Avin says, what Bar Kapara is referring to is a korban, is it meat or parts of the body that were disqualified. Now, what does it mean disqualified? So there's different levels of disqualification. If you remember, we've talked about this before. There's things that are disqualified, that if they got disqualified, a certain level of tumah or whatever it might be, if they got disqualified and you left them on the altar, right? Let's say they're pigul or something like that, whatever it is, and you put them on the altar, sometimes they're so disqualified, depends, there's kind of level 1 disqualification, level 2. If it's only level 1 disqualification, let's assume level 1 is less, then level 1 is the highest, then you have to take them off the altar. They can't be on the altar. They're so disqualified. But then there's a category of disqualified that it says about them, im Allah lo yered. If you already put it on the altar, you don't have to take it off. Okay. If it's on the altar already, you leave it there. And on the altar doesn't even mean on the fire. Could be you didn't even put it on the fire yet, just on the top of the altar. The fact that you already put it there, leave it there. You can let it burn. So comes Rabbi Avin to say that what Bar Kapara was saying was that if you have Evarei Olah that were disqualified, the level 2 disqualification that wasn't as serious, and they're allowed, once they're placed on the altar, they're allowed to stay on the altar. If they're left over in the morning, right, they didn't fully burn, you're allowed to put them on this new maracha. You might have thought, okay, look, they're somewhat disqualified. We allowed them to be burnt, but they've already gotten a little burnt. Don't put them on a new maracha, right? Let's forget about them entirely or something, not clear. But he says, no, it's to teach you, even if they're disqualified, you put the parts that haven't fully burned on the second altar, on this fourth altar, right? Number 4. So now they say, but they're going to limit what he says. It's only if they were already burned on the main altar. But if, let's say, you put them on the altar, but never burned them overnight. Remember, I told you Rashi, I just read it to you. Rashi says there's 2 options of what we're talking about here. Lo nitaklu. Lo nitaklu could be they weren't burnt at all, or lo nitaklu could be they were on the fire, but the fire was very low and they didn't fully burn all night. So he says, when we're talking, this is what the Gemara tells us, that when Rabbi Avin says the psulin go to this fourth maracha, the other one, they get put on a different maracha in the morning, is only if they already got consumed by the fire somewhat. But if they were never placed on the fire at night, but they were on the altar, so therefore they were right, lo yered, you have to burn them, then you actually put them on the main maracha, the main place where all the sacrifices get burned. Again, after you set it up in the morning for the new day, you actually burn them there because they weren't burnt at all. But as soon as they're burnt a little bit, then the psulim, the disqualified ones, go elsewhere. Igida Amre, some people say that this distinction between if mashla b'ena or lo mashla b'ena or is actually relevant to everything. Okay, what's my place? Some people say echad ksherim ve'echad psulim. This whole thing about whether they got in the fire or didn't get on the fire, this distinction is both for good, valid korbanot, perfectly valid ones, and disqualified ones. And then that would go against what Rashi said in the previous page. Im mashla b'ena or im. Ilo, lo. Rashi, like I said, yesterday's daf brought two options. Lo nitaklu, which goes on the new maracha, that could be they weren't entirely devoured because they were never put on the altar, or they weren't entirely devoured because they were put on the altar but didn't fully burn. According to that, we would put them all on this new maracha because it all goes with yesterday's stuff. But according to this reading, no, it would have to have been on the fire in order to then be moved to the this fourth maracha. If it was never on the fire, then it actually goes on the main pile, the wood pile. Okay, so there's two different ways of understanding whether that distinction between having gone on the fire and not having gone on the fire is only relevant to disqualified offerings, because again, we rather move away disqualified offerings from the main mizbeach, and therefore, once it's the next day, we're not going to let it on the main wood pile in any case, or whether this has nothing to do with disqualified, not disqualified, it's just that anything that wasn't burned at all stays on the main pile, and anything that was burned goes on the second one. Still, Bar Kapara's words stand the way the Gemara explains them, which is that Bar Kapara, who said that Rabbi Meir said that if it was left over, you make a new maracha, that's clearly going to only be referring to psulim, disqualified ones, because otherwise he is adding nothing to what Rabbi Meir said. Again, he is in the words afilu b'Shabbat possibly, but certainly that first part, he didn't need to say that. He would have just said, on Shabbat, you can do it, not afilu b'Shabbat. Afilu b'Shabbat means we're teaching you one thing, and then also we're teaching you about Shabbat. So now we're going to get to the second part, afilu b'Shabbat. So again, they're going to say, wait a minute, even Rabbi Meir says afilu b'Shabbat. How do we know? Now, the word Shabbat never appeared in our Mishnah, but what did he say? Tanina, it says in the Mishnah, v'hayom chamesh, and on this day, there's 5 marachot. Now, what does that mean? On Yom Kippur, there's an extra maracha. Now, if the wood pile, the fourth wood pile, couldn't be used on Shabbat, okay, which is again, right, now Bar Kapara has to add something that Rabbi Meir didn't say. What Rabbi Meir is saying is there's 5 marachot. Why? Because you need the fourth one for the burning of whatever was left over from last night. And you need a 5th one for Yom Kippur. Now, if it's Yom Kippur, and you need this 4th one on Yom Kippur, because otherwise you could just say the one for Yom Kippur replaces number 4, because number 4 you can't use because it has to do with yesterday's sacrifices, and yesterday's sacrifices are chol, right? Regular day, not sacred day. You can't burn those on Yom Kippur. So therefore, the fact that he says Vayom Chamesh means on Yom Kippur you also need 5, because on Yom Kippur you need the 4th pile in order to burn what was left over from Erev Yom Kippur. Now, Erev Yom Kippur is going to be a Yom Chol. So if you can't say Rabbi Meir wasn't referring to that, obviously Rabbi Meir means if you could do it on Yom Kippur, you could obviously burn them on Shabbat because the level of sanctity is basically the same, right? There's minor differences, but basically it's the same. So Amarav Acha Bar Yaakov Itzri. No, Bar Kapara still needed to tell us afilu b'Shabbat. Why? Because you don't necessarily need to infer what we just inferred from Rabbi Meir. You could say Sal Kadata Hamina. This is something that doesn't happen nowadays and didn't even happen at a certain point, even in their day. But apparently at this time, it was still going on. That Yom Kippur could have come out on Motzei Shabbat. Okay? Could have been on Sunday. So now, right now we don't do it because we don't want to have 2 days of the highest sanctity, one after the other. Because like I said, Yom Kippur is more sanctity than a holiday. So we don't want 2 high sanctities, one after the other. So now we say the following. If Yom Kippur falls after Shabbat, maybe that's the year, only in that year would you need 5 marachot. Again, why 5? Because the 4th one would be to burn whatever was left from Shabbat's offerings. Shabbat's offerings, we could see that you would burn on Yom Kippur. That makes sense because of the sanctity. But a Yom Chol, a regular day, you wouldn't be able to. And then, if you would think that it's only from Shabbat, right? Because you could say the parts left over from the sacrifice of Shabbat, you could burn on Yom Kippur. Aval be'emtza Shabbat lo. Now it's tricky. Shabbat here doesn't mean Shabbat. Shabbat means Shavua, week. But in the middle of the week, if Yom Kippur came out on a Wednesday, let's say, which often does, if Yom Kippur came out on a Wednesday, then you wouldn't be able to burn Tuesdays. And then you'd only need 4 marachot on that day. So you might have thought that when Rabbi Meir says Hayom Chamesh, he only means on a year that Shabbat came out, that Shabbat was the day before Yom Kippur. Therefore, Kamash Maran, Rav Bar Kapara needs to teach us afilu b'Shabbat, meaning even on Shabbat and Yom Kippur, any day, you can burn. All that I said a minute ago was just what you might have thought if you read Rabbi Meir without Bar Kapara. Bar Kapara comes to teach you, no matter what, doesn't matter what happened what day the day before was, you could always burn the Evarim and all that on Shabbat. Okay, that's what Bar Kapara is saying. So now Amarava, man hai delo chayesh l'kimcha. Rava says, what are you talking about here? Okay, he says, who are you who doesn't care about your flour? Now, what does this mean exactly? What does flour have anything to do with it? So a bunch of different interpretations. One is, right, if you know with flour, we've talked about many times, they sift the flour, right? There's fine flour, there's not fine flour. And you're basically someone who can't distinguish between fine flour and not fine flour. Like you don't understand things properly. You don't understand basic things. Some people say you don't take the flour that you eat, which is your fuel, right, to use it for understanding, for learning properly, right? Usually you need food to be able to focus. You don't care about your food. You're not using it for most productive means. Some people say the chet drops and it should be lekameh. You don't see what's right in front of you. Okay, and what does he say? Ha b'chol yom tnan. You can't read Rabbi Meir and think from Rabbi Meir that you would get to the conclusion that it maybe is only on Yom Kippur shechal liot achara Shabbat, because it says b'chol yom. It said in the Mishnah every day. It sounds, in other words, forget what it says about Yom Kippur, how that day is 5. Just from the simple reading of the Mishnah, it says every day there was 5. Every day means Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Shabbat. Even on Shabbat, every day there were 4. Every day there were 4. Every day means even Shabbat. So he's basically saying, how could you suggest that, right? And then Bar Kapara is questionable again, because it does seem clear from Rabbi Meir, B'chol Yom includes Shabbat, in which case we again ask on Bar Kapara, what were you adding by saying Ubiyom Shabbat? And then to which the Gemara answers, Kasha, don't really have an answer. It's actually a difficulty on Bar Kapara, why he felt the need to add Afilu Shabbat when it was quite clear from Rabbi Meir when he said B'chol Yom that he included Shabbat. But either which way, it's clear that Shabbat, that you can burn even things that are left over, right? That this new maracha is meant for those things, and they can be burnt even on Shabbat. But now we're going to say that this disagrees with Rav Huna. Upliga de Rav Huna. Da'amal tchilato doche, sofo eno doche. Not exactly clear what this means. We're going to see 2 different interpretations, and even within that, there's interpretations. But let's start right now with an interpretation. Tchilato, the beginnings of a sacrifice, override Shabbat. We're assuming the topic is Shabbat. We'll see in a minute that it's not necessarily, but right now we're going to assume it's Shabbat. The beginnings override. Sofo eno doche. That means if you start with a korban, meaning in the morning you have a korban tamid for Shabbat, of course that's going to override Shabbat and the beginnings of it, right? All the important parts of the process. But the end of the process, like for example, if you're left in the morning with stuff that didn't burn overnight, or even possibly take Friday afternoon, and Rashi brings both these as possibilities. Take Friday afternoon, you did your sacrifices, and you didn't yet burn the parts on the altar. Now remember, that's not a critical part. The critical part is the sprinkling of the blood. Once the sprinkling of the blood is done, atonement is achieved. Now normally what you would do is, especially if it's Friday, you would put up the parts to burn before Shabbat starts. Let's say you didn't. So you can't. So fo eno doche. So Rashi suggests maybe it doesn't mean only in the morning, whatever didn't burn to now put on a new maracha, a new wood pile. But Rashi suggests that maybe it even means Friday night, you can't put on the altar, right? The burning of the Evarim B'Tzalim, sometimes they started only at night. Let's say they had a busy day, they didn't get to it, they would do it at night. But you can't do it Friday night because it's Shabbat already, and you can't do Shabbat the end of a process, right? The end that's not a significant part of the process. So which basically means you would have to make sure on Friday afternoon, right? One of the things we always do, lots of things before Shabbat, we turn on our lights, we do this, right? You're in the temple, you have to make sure the Evarim Uktarim are burnt from before Shabbat. So now he basically seems to imply that this fourth maracha could not be used to burn the parts in the morning on Shabbat. This afilu b'Shabbat that Bar Kapara said, Rav Huna clearly disagrees. But now we're going to see that he doesn't clearly disagree. Gufa. So now we're going to go and understand better what Rav Huna said. Amar Rav Huna tamid, korban tamid, this is, tchilato doche, the beginnings of it again, sacrificing it, override Shabbat. Sofo eno doche, but the end part of the process is not. So that was just a quote. My eno doche, and they just happen to add the word tamid, but it doesn't really matter. That doesn't change anything. So my eno doche, notice it doesn't say eno doche Shabbat. It just says eno doche. So what does it mean eno doche? So Rav Chisda Amal, dochet HaShabbat ve'eno dochet HaTum'ah. We get back to a very famous sugya that we've seen a whole bunch of times, especially in Pesachim, about how Tumah can sometimes be overridden in the temple. And even though something is tameh, if you're supposed to sacrifice it that day and it becomes tameh, because it's its time to sacrifice it, it overrides impurity. So even though it's impure, you can still sacrifice it. So what he says is the topic of this had nothing to do with Shabbat, in which case he actually doesn't disagree with Bar Kapara, because when it says Eino doche, it is doche Shabbat, like Bar Kapara said, but it's Eino doche et hatumah, but it doesn't override impurity. So there's a few explanations of what exactly this means. When did it become impure? Let's say you had a sacrifice that became impure in the morning, and you did the sprinkling of the blood, and then it's telling you, well, you can do until the sprinkling of the blood. After that, you can't bring this anymore. That's one possibility. Another possibility is no. If you already started the whole process was done bituma, all the processes that were allowed, then you can actually finish them bituma. Okay, and you can do the burning of the parts on the altar. What you can't do is if after the korban was finished already with the main parts, the zrika, right? The zrikatam was done, the sprinkling of the blood, then it became impure. Then already we're not going to say this is doche, because again, this is not a critical element. So there's different ways of understanding exactly what this is. And when it became impure, became impure before everything was done, or maybe after the main parts were done? But either way, we're going to say the topic of Rav Huna has nothing to do with our issue with Shabbat, has to do only with impurity. The Rabbah, it says Rabbah, but it should be Rabbah, who was a generation before Rava. They lived at the same time, but he was the above generation, and he was a student of Rav Chisda, so it makes more sense that Rabbah was arguing with Rav Chisda and not Rava. Rabbah Amal dochet hatum'ah ve'eno dochet haShabbat. Rabbah understands it the way we understood it before, which is that it does override Tumah. No, if it's Tameh, it doesn't matter. Once you brought up a Tumah, it's fine. Or Tumah is overridden for this purpose to burn it on the altar, but it doesn't override Shabbat. Okay, and then that would be going against Bar Kapara. So Amalei Abai leRabbah, should be Rabbah here also. Abai says to Rabbah, L'didach kasha u'leRav Chisda kasha. Both of your opinions have difficulties in them, and it's really one and the same difficulty. L'didach kasha. So I'll start with you, Rabbah. Okay, what did Rabbah say? It overrides Tumah, but it doesn't override Shabbat. It says, Ma'ishna Tumah. Why do we think it overrides Tumah? Why does Tumah become overridden when it comes to a particular sacrifices? Dichtiv b'mo'ado. Okay, here's the verse. I put it on your sheet. It's by Midbar Kafchet Bet. Savet b'nei Israel, command the Jewish people, v'amart alehem, et korbani lachmi l'ishai rech nichochi tishmeru la'akriv li b'mo'ado. What I tell you to do, right? All these sacrifices this is in Bamidbar Kafchet, when it talks about all the ones that have particular times associated with them, make sure to sacrifice them on time. So what does on time mean? On time means even if it's impure. On time means even if it's Shabbat. Both the halachot of Tumah and Shabbat, the fact that they both override right? Shabbat overrides Malacha and Tumah, right? And Tumah is overridden in order to do the korban. And both of them, Shabbat is overridden in order to bring the sacrifice. So is Tumah. So since it says b'mo'ado v'afilu b'tumah, Shabbat nami b'mo'ado v'afilu b'Shabbat. So if you're going to say Tumah, those things should go hand in hand because they're both learned out from the same verse. And the same question is going to be for Rav Chisda, just from the opposite direction. Rav Chisda kasha, ma'ishna Shabbat. And it's why did Rav Chisda say Shabbat is over? You can do it even on Shabbat, burn these parts of the animal that are still left. Tichtiv b'moado, because it says do the sacrifice, and everything about the sacrifice that needs to be done during that time, do it on time, right? The evarim from yesterday are supposed to be burned overnight, and if they didn't burn overnight, you have to burn them in the morning. So basically, yeah, even b'Shabbat, in which case tumanami b'moado v'afilu b'tumah. So if you think it overrides Shabbat, then you should also think the tumah is overridden, and you should bring it. You should burn them on the altar, even if they became impure. So Amar le. I'm going to explain to you according to my answer, and I'm going to explain to you according to Rav Chisda's answer. Each one obviously separately. Ladidi lo kasha. My opinion is not difficult. Why? Sofo kitchilato. The end is like the beginning. What does that mean? Tum'ah ditchilato bar midcha tumahi. Okay, the beginnings. Okay, in the beginning, it can be right. What happens in the beginning of a sacrifice? When you go to sprinkle the blood or whatever it is, slaughter, do all those processes, collect the blood, bring it to the altar and sprinkle it, tumah is overridden. And therefore, sofo namidache. So therefore, even if you say like Rashi did, which is, or like an opinion that I brought before, it wasn't Rashi, but an opinion we brought before, that even if the tumah happens after that stage, after the stage of the zrika, still we're talking about the concept of tumah, that if it were the beginning of the process, it would have been overridden. Therefore, the end of the process will also be overridden. But Shabbat, this sacrifice would not have overridden Shabbat. Why not? Because it's not been moado. This sacrifice was a Friday sacrifice. A Friday sacrifice will never be, let's say we forgot to bring the korban tamid on Friday. Can you bring it on Shabbat? Of course not, right? A korban that's supposed to be brought on Friday can't be brought on Shabbat. So therefore, since the beginning of the sacrifice wasn't capable of overriding Shabbat, so fonami lo dache. So therefore, the burning of the parts on the altar, again, either we're talking about burning them because you didn't even start Friday afternoon. So to start Friday night, you can't do it. Or maybe we mean whatever didn't get burned on the altar overnight, and then you want to move it now to this new altar, you can't do this new wood pile. You can't do that. Okay? Because this whole sacrifice would never have overridden Shabbat in the first place. It would have overridden Tumah. There were Tamei before, but it wouldn't have overridden Shabbat. And that's why I think this isn't Doche Shabbat, even though it's Doche Tumah. Now we have to explain the opposite with Rav Chisda, why Tumah will not be overridden and Shabbat will be overridden. So the Rav Chisda lo kashya, sofo kitchilato leitle. He doesn't hold this sofo kitchilato like Rabba did. But he has a different logic, which is Shabbat dehutrahi b'tzibur sofo namidache. Tumah deduchuyi b'tzibur tchilato deikar kapara dache. Sofo delav ikar kapara lo dache. Okay, we get back to a very famous machloket. If you remember, we've seen this many times. When we say Tumah hutra b'tzibur, right, which again means either if the majority of the community or the majority of the kohanim or tmeim, right, you can bring the sacrifice, or it means when it comes to a korban sibur, a communal offering, we offer it anyway, even if it became tameh. We learned this all in Pesachim. But there was a big debate: is Tumah dechuya or is it hutra? What's dechuya? Dechuya means it's overridden, but it's still there. We still view it as tameh. We just allow certain things. So now it's going to be since we say Tumah dechuya, and by the way, we paskin the Tumah dechuya, and therefore here they don't even mention the opinion, the Tumah hutra. Tumah hutra would mean it's entirely permitted. It overrides it to the extent that it's as if it's no longer tameh. But that's not what we hold. So they say Tumah is dechuya. It's still there. It's just that we allow you. Now, what do we allow you to do? Well, we allow you to do ikar kapara, that's atchala. The beginning stages are the main parts. That we're going to allow you to do with the tameh sacrifice. But the end part is not significant, and therefore we're not going to allow it for the end part, because that's not an important part. And since we still view it as tameh, Whereas when it comes to Shabbat, and you're in the mikdash, this is very interesting. It's as if there's no Shabbat, right? It's for purposes of a korban, Shabbat is entirely permitted. We don't say, trying to minimize what you do, right? In the temple, when it comes to sacrifices, you do what you need. There's no issue of Shabbat. It's as if Shabbat is entirely permitted for this purpose. Therefore, once Shabbat is permitted for sacrifices, we're going to allow you even to burn yesterday's sacrifices on Shabbat. And that's where Rav Chisda makes the opposite distinction. It's doche Shabbat. It's not doche impurity. Okay, now we're going to start our last section for today. We're moving on to something else, and our last section for the chapter. We're going to finish the chapter right now. So for this, we have to look back at verses we saw yesterday. Yesterday, we saw the following verses. We were in Vayikra chapter 6, verse 5 and verse 6. Ha'esh al hamizbeach tukabo, the fire will be lit on the altar. Lo tichbe, it will never go out, meaning you're not allowed to put out the coals. You can't put them out if they're on the altar. And esh hamizbeach esh tamid tukadal hamizbeach lo tichbe. Right, the fire will always be on the altar, lo tichbe, right? Some Rabbi Yossi, remember, taught that, teaches us a third maracha. In any case, both these psukim say you're not allowed to put out coals that are on the wood pile on the altar. So now we have a debate. Itmar. Itmar is usually an introduction to a debate between two Amoraim. We're usually going to get what each one says, and then sometimes we get the reason why they say it. Today we don't get that. We're going to have the Gemara then narrow the machloket, limited. Hamechabe esh machte uminora. You have the wood piles. Clearly, you can't put out the fire while it's in the wood pile. What if you take it off the wood pile? For what purpose? Well, we know already. You put it in the machta. That's the pan, the shovel that you're going to then carry it into the Kodesh Kodeshim on Yom Kippur. Or you take it to light the menorah. So you take the coals from here. Presumably, this would even be if you're going to burn the incense, right? Also there, you took a shovel. Remember, on the inner altar on an everyday basis. So whether you're going to do the ketoret, the incense on the inner altar, or you're going to do the ketoret and the Kodesh Kodeshim, the incense inside the Holy of Holies on Yom Kippur, or you're using it to light the menorah, if you're going to take it from there, and then you take it from the wood pile, you start walking toward there, and you put it out then. Now, what did our pasuk say? Our pasuk said, Eish HaMizbeach. This is really a naming issue. What do you call this fire? Is it considered still fire from the altar, or is it not? Did it change names already because you're using it for something else? In which case, you'll no longer be liable if you burn it, if you put it out. Sabai Amar Chayav, Rava Amar Patur. Okay, Abai says you're still obligated. You cannot put out this fire. And Rava, I don't know if he says he's not saying it's allowed to put out the fire, but if you do, you're exempt. You're not over on this halacha. You didn't transgress. Lo tichbe. Because it's no longer considered Eish HaMizbeach. Now the question is, what exactly is there machloket about? And we're going to see two different readings. So the first version goes like this. There's a few stages. When you take it off the pile, you're still on the altar. You haven't yet gone down the altar. So if you're still at the top of the altar, everyone agrees that while you're still on the altar, this is still called Eish HaMizbeach because you still have the fire that came from the altar, that came from the wood pile there, and you're still on the altar itself. So everyone will agree you're still obligated. Kipliga, the machloket is it's once you get down to the ground and you're no longer standing on the altar. Okay, in this sugya in general, we see this idea that in Mizbeach, it's almost like when you play tag and you're on base. You know, the Mizbeach is base. So while you're still on, that's what we said, if things, if you already put it on the altar, even though it's not on the wood pile, even though it's disqualified, it still could go on. Okay, also there's another halach I didn't mention, which is, by the way, the whole thing of these evarim being left overnight. You might say, don't we have this psul lina? Remember, things that get left overnight are already disqualified, so how can we be burning them in the morning? But anything that's on the altar, again, using the tag reference, you're on base, it's not psul lina. There is no disqualification of being left overnight because you kept it in a sanctified place. So you kept it going and it didn't kind of go out by nighttime. So by the night passing, which is what psul lina is. If you kind of left it overnight, leaving it is like leaving it in a place that's not important. If you left it on the altar, that's okay. So likewise here, as long as it's on the altar, it's still Eish HaMizbeach. The question is, once you brought it down to the ground, did it change names? And now it's called Eish Machta or Eish Menorah, right? It has a different name. So Abai Amar Chayav, Eish HaMizbeach. He says, you still took it from the altar. It's still called Eish HaMizbeach. You're just moving it locations, but it's still the same thing. Rav Amar Patur, Kevan Nitka, Nitka. You already took it away from there. It's already disconnected from the altar. It's not considered fire of the altar anymore. And only, remember, the pasuk says, it's a fire of the altar. This is no longer a fire of the altar. Now they're going to bring this line of Rav Nachman. Ela hada amar Rav Nachman, amar Rabba Baravua. He says in the name of Rabba Baravua, המוריד גחלת מעל גבי המזבח וחיבה, חייב. If you take a coal from off the top of the altar and you put it out, you're obligated. Now, what did we just say? So this would match only Abaye's opinion, not Rava, because Rava said if you put it on the ground, it doesn't matter. It's still considered Esham's Beth. So are we to say that what Rav Nachman said in the name of Rav Ravua, Kiman ke Abaye, only matches Abaye's opinion? So they're saying no. We'll explain Rava also the same, because Rav Nachman isn't really talking about the same situation. Why? Afilu tema kerava, hatam lo intik lemitzvata, hacha intika lemitzvata. Intik means, right, it was taken away. Now, you removed it from the altar. Rav and Abaye were discussing, you removed it to put it on the Mizbach HaKtoret, or to bring it inside the Kodesh Kodeshim. That means it's no longer Eish HaMizbech. Why? Because you transferred it. It now is called Eish HaMachta or Eish HaMenorah. It has a different name. It has a different purpose. But Rav Nachman, in the name of Rav Ravua, says you just took the coals and you put them on the ground. He doesn't say why. You weren't doing it for any mitzvah purpose. You just did it. You took them off, you put them on the ground, and now you blew them out. He says that's still, even according to Rava could say that you're still obligated there, because to change the name of Eish HaMizbech to not being Eish HaMizbech, it can't just be that you just took it off for no purpose. It has to have a new purpose, a new goal, right? That in order to call it, to change the name, it's no longer considered fire of the altar, has to be that it has a new destiny. Its goal is towards something else. That changes its name. If you just take it off, even Rava will agree you can't put it out, you can't extinguish it, because if you did, right, it's still called Eish HaMizbech as long as you haven't given it some other purpose. That's the first way of reading it. So again, what we started with was Machloket Abaye and Rava Chayav Patur. We said, which case do they argue about? Which case do they not? They all agree if it's on the altar, it's still a problem. It's still Eish HaMizbech, even though you designated it for a different mitzvah. Their machloket is when it gets to the ground. Rav Nachman, in the end, we thought maybe it only works with Abaye. In the end, we said it works with everyone. Now we're going to have a whole different reading. Everyone agrees that once it gets to the ground, of course it's something else at this point. It's no longer Eish HaMizbech because it's not on the altar anymore. So Rav and Abaye will both agree that you're exempt when it gets to the floor. But kiplige, when's their machloket then? It's when you take it off the wood pile and you put it in the machta or whatever you put it in to carry it to the menorah, for example. That's the machloket. Abaye amar chayav, because Eish HaMizbechu, you're still on the altar, it's still called Eish HaMizbech. Rava amar patur, kevan nitka, you already took it off the wood pile. It doesn't matter that you're still on the mizbech. You destined this for, you determined this is going, or you designated is the word I'm thinking of. You designated it right now for a different mitzvah. So it's no longer called Eish HaMizbech, even though you happen to be standing on the altar. This is against this idea that altar is base almost, right? For this purpose, it's not still considered on the altar. You are on the altar, but it's no longer the designation of what the eitz on the maracha was for. You're not bringing it somewhere else. So it's no longer called that, and you're going to be exempt. So now we have a bigger problem with Rav Nachman. You're obligated when you get to the ground. Now, neither Rav nor Abaye thought you're obligated when you get to the ground. They both said as soon as you get to the ground, of course it's called something else. It's not Eish HaMizbech anymore. So kiman to lo k'Abaye v'lo k'Abaye v'lo k'Rava matches neither of them. To which the Gemara answers the exact same answer as before, because this is just a different version of the same thing. Again, both times they bring Rav Nachman in the name of Rav Ravua, they're assuming they're talking about the same thing, and the answer is, oh no, they're talking about something different. Hatam lo intik lemitzvata. Rav Nachman says you're obligated when even on the ground. Even Rav and Abaye will both agree because you didn't designate it for anything else. It was just taken off randomly for no real reason. In that case, it's still called Eish HaMizbech. It doesn't lose its term mizbech just because it got off the altar. It was fire that came from the altar. You're not allowed to put it out. But hacha intik lemitzvata. But if it was taken out for a mitzvah, then of course it has a new name, and everyone agrees, according to this reading, that you're no longer going to be obligated. With that, hadran alach taraf b'kalpi, and tomorrow we're going to get into the Ktoret, how you do the chofen of the Ktoret, and again, right, read up on Shuli's article about the incense in general to get all the background. With that, we'll finish for today. Have a great day, everyone.